I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and a ton of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, I'd have to move somewhere else. It's just one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there for too long. At least, if you don't have anything going for you. Excluding a handful of doctors and lawyers and Georgia Power Company employees, the only employment in the area is at Walmart, fast food, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there's a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town, and there's no cell phone service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads. The gravel parking lots at some of them glitter with bits of broken glass from what I'm guessing were car windows. Sometimes, there are really shifty people hanging around these trailheads or just driving around on the Forest Service roads. These are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat-up $500 cars just barreling along roads meant for a 4x4. Some of these people you see in these cars honestly look like the guy that got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. All of that being said, it's still a great place to camp, however, you just have to be really careful. A few years ago, 2 of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the National Forest. Probably not legal, I know. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip so we could play the next morning, too. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drive a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up all the spots in the area. This was really the only camping spot that we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late. We decide to keep on looking, so we drive for about an hour further and further into the woods. By this time, it's getting a bit dark and we're getting a bit worried about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any service. We turn off into an unfamiliar road that isn't in very good shape. In fact, it looks like the Forest Service Rangers used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. That said, it looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over the mound. There was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few miles down the road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which seemed kind of odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running and we set up the tent. As we were setting up the tent, I started to notice that there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the area. I see a green bottle laying on the ground. I take a look at the label and see that it's a bottle of home and garden insecticide. I was really tired at the time and I just thought that someone had been dumping their home garbage out here. None of us thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage in an area that is more than an hour from the nearest home. We set up camp, had some beers, and made chili from scratch. By this time, it was probably around 11 p.m. As we're eating, we notice a faint glow from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles didn't make sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was kind of like that glow you see over a bright city. We couldn't see the light source itself though. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we decided it wasn't other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to go investigate. Under normal circumstances, I know I wouldn't have done so. However, we all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and the two of us, Jacob and I, decided to go take a look. My other friend, Isaac, decides to stay behind to pop some popcorn over the fire. We start walking towards the light source, and the situation gets even stranger. All the trees in the area have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been the work of a beaver that lived in the creek, but it seemed strange that a beaver would go around all these trees and just knock the bark off in a circle. Jacob and I start talking about the ghost beaver in pretty loud voices, probably due to our drunkenness. As we're almost to the top of the hill, Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh shit!" A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We look at each other and decide that maybe we don't need to see what that light was after all. We walk back in silence and keep looking back every few seconds. We decide to turn off our flashlight and just use the moonlight to get back to the campsite. When we get a couple of 100 feet from the campsite, I can see my other friend Isaac walking around the campsite. He was wearing a hooded coat that I hadn't seen him wearing before. For some reason, he's carrying his paintball gun around in his hand. That seems a little odd, we said to each other. The fire had started to die down, so we couldn't see our campsite very well. At this point, we'd probably been gone for almost an hour. From the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept walking around the site and was peering into the tent. When we were almost back to the campsite, we saw Isaac walk up the road we came in on. We figured that he was going to go use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to come back. All of a sudden, we see him lurch out of the tent. He stumbles a few feet and vomits. After we left, he apparently had a few more rum and cokes. At least, that's what he mumbled to us. We ask him why he kept wandering around the campsite with the paintball gun, and he gets a strange look on his face. "Dude, they're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it?" We go and check the truck, enter the door code, and see all of our paintball equipment just as we left it before. The keys to the truck were still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. I get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Isaac, what were you doing after we left?" I ask. I was watching a movie on my phone, then I fell asleep, I guess." "But you were walking around with your paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets?" Isaac said that he had been in the tent since we left, and that he had been wearing the same outfit all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us were way too drunk to drive, but we decided to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We don't bother packing up the tent, we just fold it down with the sleeping bags and everything else in it. We jump in the F-150 and I start to drive out. When we get to the dirt hump, we see something gray blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods earlier is now back on its stand, right on top of the hump from earlier. By this point, all of us have sobered up to the situation. No one wants to get out of the car to try and move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of the F-150, so I drive forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. It falls right off. It must have just been balanced on top or something, and we drive over it slowly. We were terrified that it would pop one of the truck's tires as we drove over it, but thank God it didn't. As we drive down the road, we see a vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching glimpses of it as the moon reflects light off of it. I start to drive as fast as I can on the Forest Service road, and the other vehicle keeps pace. It doesn't get any closer though. It stays 1 or 2 turns behind us. We can only see it when the road straightens out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we make it back to the main paved road. I start to drive everyone back to my house, but I decide to go a different way just to be safe. I didn't get pulled over for a DUI, luckily. Camping can be fun, but areas like that can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place. I would never go down that road again, though. This didn't happen to me, rather my dad and a group of his friends when they were kids. He's told me this story a few times, since it really creeped him out. He was around 12 years old at the time, I'd wager, so this took place in the mid to late 80s. My dad and a group of his friends decided to camp out, so they told their parents the usual "I'm sleeping at so-and-so's house" lies and headed out. They hiked down motorways and a few twisting country lanes to an area of grassland with plenty of trees where they figured they wouldn't be discovered, and they set up camp. They talked for a while, and when it began to get dark, they decided to set fire to an old fallen tree to provide some extra warmth and light. They carried on talking around the tree for a while, and all was well until all of a sudden they became aware of a white van driving towards them out of nowhere. They immediately began to panic. Their parents would kill them if they were discovered. The van, a dirty white Transit, slowed to a stop, and the doors opened. 2 men got out and they walked towards my dad and his friends. "We're police officers," one of them said. He held up a dirty, torn pad of paper, presumably by way of identification. By this point, my dad and his friends were so scared about being found out by their parents that they didn't even notice the anomalies of the dirty, unmarked transit van and the lack of correct identification. Never mind the fact that the men were wearing dirty clothes themselves. Definitely not police standard uniform. "You've set fire to a listed tree," said the second one. They stepped forward. "We're going to need you to come with us in the van." My dad and his friends were terrified. They were going to be in so much trouble for sneaking out, let alone for having been arrested. Fearing these apparent authority figures, they felt that they had no choice but to go with the officers. They walked towards the van and the men opened the back doors for them to get inside. But inside of this van was definitely not that of a police vehicle, and even the kids snapped out of their fear-induced reveries and realized this when they saw that the space they were faced with was dirty, stained with unknown substances, and was jam-packed with an array of rusty tools, manual and power. "Get in," one of the men repeated, then tried to push one of the boys into the van. This was the final straw. The boys knew that this was not right. My dad shouted for everybody to run and they all scattered. The men cursed and got back into the van and began to chase the boys. For what seemed like an eternity, the men chased them. The journey home was not a quick one and the boys ended up alone, fending for themselves very soon. My dad remembers hiding in the bushes in the country lanes, having to jump over hedges whilst this van's headlights were showing up everywhere, following them. The men in the van didn't give up for quite a bit, but eventually my dad found his way through the country lanes, up the motorways, and home safe. He received a severe talking to from his parents for turning up home so late, but by this point, he hardly cared. Who knows what those men's intentions really were? In May 2009, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto and were still stuck living together after the breakup as we didn't know that many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and upsetting. So when a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend camping/fishing trip, I jumped at the chance. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful, loads of lush forest, farmers' fields, and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a creek called Grindstone Creek. It's close to some wetlands and the fishing is supposed to be great. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field. I'm guessing it was probably trespassing on our part, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, talking about random shit, and drinking some quality craft beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. All in all, it was a really good night. We turned in just after midnight, and we shared a tent. My buddy fell asleep before me, and I stayed up playing on my phone until probably around 1:30. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was being woken up by a high-pitched yipping type noise. I was kind of groggy and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was incessant and it sounded like a weird coyote or something. I laid there for a moment listening and then started playing on my phone again. The noise was annoying as hell. I tried ignoring it, but it sounded like it was getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet from the tent. At this point, I was getting a little unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before and I thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a small-ish dog. But what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food? I have a pretty bad anxiety disorder, so I'm prone to worrying about these types of things. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, and he was. The noise woke him up too. We discussed what to do about the coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters. Not a BB gun, nothing. Finally, he decided he would shine his flashlight on it and yell a lot, hopefully scaring it off. He unzipped the tent and I watched him pointing the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. His legs suddenly went all wobbly and he sort of stumbled backwards into the tent. He had a really dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me and babbled, "It's not a coyote, it's a dude, it's some weird dude." Normally, I would have thought he was messing with me. I'm a huge wimp and I scare easily. I won't even watch horror movies. But I've never seen someone look so scared. And I never want to see that expression on someone's face again. So I knew he wasn't pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling type noises were still going on, and in retrospect, it really didn't sound like a coyote, but I guess in our groggy states it was a way for our brains to make sense of it. Anyways, he kept telling me just to look out the tent flap to make sure he's not crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing. I felt like shit, but I had to look. So I slowly peeked out the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust, and that's when I saw him. He was standing only a few arms lengths away from the tent. He was swaying a little and wearing a baseball cap. What made it awful though, what was really, really creepy, was that he was wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew there was most likely something very wrong with this guy. If the making high-pitched noises at a stranger's tent in the middle of the night didn't give that away. After I pulled my head back inside the tent, my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at the guy to fuck off. My buddy started yelling, "Excuse me, can you fuck off? We're trying to sleep in here." The noise stopped. It was dead silent, and that's when we heard footsteps running towards the tent. They stepped right outside the tent, but we didn't waste any time. We started yelling again. Seriously, fuck off! We have cell phones in here. If you don't fuck off, we're going to call the cops. With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off. It sounded like he was moving towards the road. Needless to say, we laid awake, petrified, until the first sign of sunlight. Then we hightailed it the hell out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home, and we were both pretty embarrassed about how scared we got. It definitely was not manly on either of our parts. I think because we were both ashamed of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much, we haven't really ever talked about it since that day, so there you go, there's my weird story. I'll always wonder what the hell that guy was doing out there, or what was wrong with him. Sometimes I wonder if things would have turned out differently if we were a couple girls. I'm not saying he was some serial killer or something, but it seemed like he was testing who was in the tent, maybe. I guess I'll never know, and for that, I'm kind of glad.